Well, welcome to episode 101 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time we're going to talk about Antonio Carlos Jobim's classic album from 1970, Stoneflower. I have here an Italian reissue from 1974. This came out on CTI Records, which is Creed Taylor's label. And like so many CTI releases, it's got a great Pete Turner photograph on the cover of Jobim enjoying a cigarette, very 1970. Parenthetically, I know I have a number of Brazilian viewers, and I'm sorry I'm not able to actually get Portuguese subtitles to these videos, but I will try and speak a little more clearly in English than I usually am able to do so, and thank you for watching. And for everybody who is watching, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, I would be so grateful if you could just click on that little link in the top right of your screen. Thanks. Antonio Carlos Jobim, better known as Tom Jobim in his native Brazil, was the primary force behind certainly the composition of so many of the greatest songs of Bossa Nova. On this album, he's still at his peak, even as the curtain is coming down in the Bossa Nova era internationally, which really lasts from about 1960-61 until around 1970 or 71. On this album, Jobim is surrounded by pretty much A-list jazz players, both of Brazilian origin and Americans as well. It is sophisticated music, it's an elegant album, and I think for the listener it reveals more and more of itself every time you put it on. So beginning in the later 40s, in his late teens and early 20s, Jobim starts playing piano in and around the clubs and bars of Rio. By the early 1950s, he's making a bit of money writing music and he's getting his compositions published. His first big break comes when there's a play produced in Brazil called Orfeu da Conceição, or Orpheus of the Conception. And he, along with a quite remarkable figure in Brazilian musical history, a guy called Vinicius de Moraes, who was a poet and a diplomat and a lyricist and kind of a giant figure and a mystical figure in the history of Bossa Nova, produced a score including lyrics for this play. The play, which basically tells the story of Orpheus and Eurydice but sets it in a poor neighborhood in Rio, is then turned into a film called Orfeo Negro, or Black Orpheus. And for the film version, Tom and Vinicius are asked to produce a soundtrack, which is very influential and most famously include the composition A Felicidade, which has become a standard in Brazil and outside Brazil. Around this time, Jobim's popular song compositions were getting more traction, and a singer called João Gilberto, one of the other giants of early Bossa Nova, releases an album called Chega de Saudade, which includes a number of Jobim compositions, including Desafinado, which would become a huge hit later in the 60s for other artists. Taken together, this film score of Jobim and Vinicius, plus Gilberto's album, kicks off the Bossa Nova craze in Brazil. So far so good for Tom Jobim, but things are going to get better, because in 1961, a little-known jazz guitarist out of Manhattan, a guy called Charlie Bird, is part of one of the State Department's goodwill / propaganda tours, call it what you want, and part of the itinerary for that tour is in Brazil. He finds a number of records with a lot of Jobim compositions, he likes them, takes them back home, and in his apartment in Manhattan, he invites over Stan Getz, the jazz saxophonist, and plays these records. And Getz agrees with Bird that these are fantastic songs, and they decide to make an album together. So in 1962, Bird and Getz team up on an album called Jazz Samba, which is a huge hit. The dam really breaks when Getz collaborates with Jobim, with Gilberto, and also with Gilberto's wife, Astrid. And they produce in 1963 or 64, I forget exactly which, an album called Getz Gilberto. Takes the Bossa Nova craze, which at that point had been limited to Brazil and the United States, and basically makes it a phenomenon across much of the Western world, if not the whole world. And that was a craze which was to last pretty much all the way up until 1970. Creed Taylor, the producer who had made Getz Gilberto, leaves Verve Records, which had released that album, and moves over to A&M at this time. First thing he does is sign Jobim to A&M, and they produce a solo album for Jobim called Wave, which is a terrific album in its own right and sells extremely well, and so Jobim's fame continues to roll on. When Taylor decides to leave A&M in 1970 and go out on his own, first thing he does is bring Jobim along with him, and the first thing they do is they record this album. Incidentally, at the same time, they still owed an album to A&M to follow up on Wave, and they made it at exactly the same time as they recorded this album. They took the best songs from that session, they put them on Stoneflower, and they gave A&M the rest of it, and that was released as the album Tide, which is not bad, but is no patch on Wave, and is not nearly as good as this album. So as I mentioned, the production team and the musicians on here are pretty much A-listers all the way down the line. Creed Taylor is the producer, Rudy Van Gelder as the engineer, Joe Farrell is playing soprano saxophone, tremendous player in his own right, and would go on to have quite a career in jazz funk in the early 70s. Irby Green is playing trombone. Hubert Laws and Airto Moreira, two other guys who would have great jazz funk careers in the 1970s, are on flute and percussion respectively. Ron Carter, who had anchored the Miles Davis Quintet on bass for a number of years, is here on bass. And the string overdubs are marshaled and arranged by Deodato, who would be a real fixture of Taylor's CTI releases throughout the 1970s. All the compositions on the album are Jobim's, with the exception of Brazil, which is by Ari Barroso. The first song on side one is Teresa My Love, which is written by Jobim for his wife. It's a classic, simple bossa rhythm tapped out on piano. Irby Green on trombone carries the early melody. He's accompanied by Deodato on guitar and Jobim on piano. A really, really beautiful tune, a classic in the canon of bossa nova, and I would say one of my 10 or 15 most favorite bossa nova songs. That's followed by Children's Games, which has a simple, kind of echo-laden melody laid over a much more complex and syncopated 4 or 5 part rhythm track. Then a song called Choro, which is named after the most popular style of Brazilian music. You have effectively a trio. You've got Ron Carter on bass, you've got Jobim on piano, and you have Airto on percussion. The string section comes in here and there as a counterpoint. I'm not sure that entirely works, but those little pieces with those 3 players are just fantastic. The final piece on side one is pretty much the centerpiece of the album, and it's Jobim's homage to Ari Barroso, the famous Brazilian composer. And it's, of course, Barroso's most famous song, Aquarela do Brasil, or as it's translated normally into English, Brazil. The story of this song is that Barroso was going out for the evening in Rio, and he was prevented from going out by an absolutely torrential downpour. And he began to reflect on the rain and the physical and natural characteristics of Brazil, the splendors and wonder of the country. And what you get is the first great contribution to a style of music which came to be known as samba exaltação, which basically means exaltation samba, or samba which exalts the country of Brazil. Jobim, of course, is a big fan of Barroso, and this song is lovingly delivered, lovingly produced, lovingly performed. Jobim starts off on Fender Rhodes, and with the percussion and with his electric piano absolutely evoking that sense of rainfall, humidity, the whole environment that Barroso was in when he was writing the song. The greatness of this song, of course, comes from all the great little hooks and melodies in its composition, and the group here do not disappoint at all. So side 2 starts with the title track, Stoneflower, which is a classic Jobim melody, a classic bossa nova, at the same time feathery light and a little bit sad. Jobim is on piano, Laws is on flute. They first set the melody out, and then you've got other players taking turn. This is probably the biggest ensemble recording, the most jazz track-like recording in the whole album. It's followed by Amparo, which is a moody, melancholic kind of song, almost verging on the classical in its composition. Then Andorinha, which has a smooth, classic bossa nova introduction. Jobim's solo itself is wonderfully accompanied by Ron Carter on bass. I haven't mentioned Ron Carter too much, but this guy was an absolute master of his craft, and his playing here in support of Jobim is so sensitive and so sympathetic. It's really magical, and Taylor really accents his playing here in his production of this track. Followed by probably the weirdest track in the album, which is God and the Devil in the Land of the Sun. This has some riffing from the horn section to start off, and then a tense, vibrating string figure and a really wild solo on soprano sax from Joe Farrell, almost close to free jazz at points. It's fantastic, but really quite distinct from other things on the album. And then we come to the final track of the album. The first track of the album was a very beautiful bossa tune, and we have a very beautiful tune to round it out, and that is Sabia. Sabia is a Portuguese word. It means song thrush, which is effectively the national bird of Brazil. Jobim was quite given to natural imagery as inspiration in his songwriting, and this is not the first time that birds make their way into one of his works. Jobim's singing here, as it commonly is a little bit edgy and uncertain, and it somehow totally works. It's almost a truism to say that he's singing really well in this bossa nova number, because his singing is almost inextricable from the whole concept of bossa nova. He's surrounded too by some wonderful musicians here, and the contrast between all that professionalism and that quavery delivery is really kind of electric, even on a very subtle and gentle track like this. So how to sum up Stoneflower? I think there are maybe 5 essential Jobim records. I'm sure some people would consider that to be a sacrilegious statement, but if you could only buy 5, I would buy 3 collaborations and 2 solo records. The 3 collaborations I would buy are Gets Gilberto from 1964, I would buy the collaboration with Sinatra from 1967, and I would buy the collaboration with Elis Regina from 1974, which is a superb album. The two solo records of his, I think one has to collect if you're limited to that number of records, are Wave from 1967 and this one from 1970. It has Bossa Nova's greatest composer, still at the top of his game, being produced by one of the most sympathetic fans of Bossa Nova, Creed Taylor, and surrounded by an incredible cast of musicians. It's not a perfect record by any stretch of the imagination. Some things don't really come off here, but for the most part they do. It's one of his best ever solo outings, and it's a record which rewards you with something new every time you listen to it. I give it 4 stars out of 5.